Why, hello. This is John Huey and my co-host Michael Tingley.
Hello?
And this is episode 17, believe it or not, of the Sober Atheist podcast. And this is our first outing in 2025, which we're certain will be a very eventful year. Today's the 16th of January, 2025. And Michael, I promise not to talk about what's going to happen in 4 days. All right. So I'm leaving that alone on this podcast.
Good.
Okay. All right. But because what we're going to talk about are some things that are both universal and quite personal to both of us on this podcast. And we're going to talk about atheism, the creative process, and recovery. And as I mentioned, we are here on the 16th of January, 2025. And it is a notable day for a very sad reason. We lost one of our greatest American artists today, and I would submit one of our greatest Americans, period, today, with the death of David Lynch at age 78. And I'm sure there's going to be reams of copy and lots of media and lots of things surrounding him and his legacy in these coming days. And this is not a David Lynch memorial podcast, but I felt it was very appropriate if we're going to talk about the creative process. I don't think he was a person in recovery from alcoholism or drugs. Oh, he did have a little bit of a cigarette problem, I think. But
fatal cigarette problem.
Yeah, fatal cigarette, as it turned out, unfortunately. And but he was an innovator on a level that illustrated what creative people at their best do. In my opinion, creative people at their best change the way you see the world, change the way you envision reality, and have sometimes enormous impacts on media and communications and art in general. And I'm not a film critic or a television critic, but I will say that David Lynch changed the way that I viewed the world through the magnificence of his personal vision, right? He made a major impact on millions and millions of people around the world, thinking people who were inclined to be attracted to the manner in which he perceived reality, which was truly extraordinary. And both myself and Michael, in very different ways, have had considerable involvement with the creative process. From a very young age, I was attracted to writers and writing and poetry and expression in a manner in which it seemed that I could communicate some new or interesting things in the media that I was attracted to. And, started writing my first little things as a 16-year-old kid. And then later on, when I finally got to a good college with a good creative writing teacher, I was very fortunate to be a student of the novelist John Irving in my little jerkwater hippie school, no longer in existence, up in Putney, Vermont, Wyndham College. And I sat in John's creative writing class for a couple of years, and he was very encouraging and very helpful to me on a lot of different levels. I still consider him a friend, even though not a close friend, someone I have been able to communicate with from time to time. And, the idea was that, at least the idea that I formulated in my own mind, was that I was headed in a direction creatively that might result in some substantial work somewhere down the line. And I got it in my head that I had some capabilities, and I had few little publications here and there, and had thought that I was going to go somewhere with that. And I always was informed in the work that I was doing, in the writing that I was doing, by something I would refer to as the atheist perspective, where I was, from my point of view, dealing with real situations in a real world and trying to innovatively describe my own and other people's reaction to the world as I saw it in the light of the facts that presented themselves to me. Even though I was not an atheist writer in that sense, I always felt that my atheism informed the type of work that I tried to do.
Mm-hmm.
There was just a little problem, though, okay? While I was in college, I had started drinking at about age 15 and had my first serious encounters with some consequences resulting from my drinking. But by the time I had been in and out of college, it was the late 60s, early 70s, a lot of stuff happened. I was, lovingly invited to leave school a couple of times. And fortunately, had a very supportive family that gave me the opportunity to get back into a pretty good school and to finally graduate, get a degree. But by the time that I finally did graduate from college in May of 1972, I had a raging case of alcoholism. I don't think that I was born addicted, as I may have mentioned before in other podcasts, because I'm really the only identifiable alcoholic in my immediate family that I know of. So I don't think there's much of a genetic component to my case. But I most certainly, when I drank enough, I became addicted to that substance.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I sailed out of there, instead of sailing into graduate school, which took me a few years to get it together to do that, I sailed on, I left Vermont, came back to my hometown, and planted myself firmly on a bar stool in Bohemian Central Control at the Admiral Benbow Bar on the 1600 block of Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, in the marvelous DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, where it was still cheap enough to live as a young broke person, and there were still a number of people that passed themselves off as writers and artists and poets. And, some people of note, some people of not so great note. Um, and I was looking at Carter's funeral the other day. There were good artists around when I saw Carter's funeral the other day, or last week or whenever it was. When you go into that cathedral, you go through that door, and above that door is a sculpture by a guy by the name of Frederick Hart, who was a habitué of the Admiral Benbow Bar way back when. Okay. A little bit later, when he started making a little money, I think he moved down to the Child Herald. But, he and a couple of other, Washington figurative painters and a couple people like that were around that place. So that we had some idea that we were in a creative environment. But where I really was, though, was, unlike my old creative writing teacher, who at age 20 or 21 or whatever was off at the Iowa Writers Workshop diligently writing every day, right? I was sitting in the Admiral Benbow Bar talking about art and imagery and writing and, scribbling a few things down, but not achieving what I thought there was to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And my drinking obscured that.
How old were you at this point?
Oh, at that point, I guess like 22, 23, somewhere there. Certainly old enough to know better, and old enough to be starting doing what I thought I could have been doing. And, I had had a couple of opportunities to do things like get out of Washington, move to New York, uh, do some other creative things in other places, apply for fellowships, this, that, and the other. And, I chose to sit at the Admiral Benbow Bar and get my shitty job downtown, underemployed downtown, and drink. And not really fully recognizing that until after I met the lady who was going to become my first wife, and after going to Georgetown University, which I was lucky enough to get into, and failing to complete a program there because I guess I thought my drinking and my fighting with wife number one was more important than finishing my graduate school program at Georgetown and getting further and further into the widening gyre of this so-called bohemianism, which was really basically alcoholism. Now, unlike others, I sometimes took a cue or two from people I met along the way. And after my first marriage quite tragically ended, I ended up by 1980 or so becoming involved with a lady a few years older than I was, who was a pretty accomplished Washington professional who started hammering away at me about making money. Okay. And somehow or another, I sort of incorporated some of what she was saying to me. And despite my continuing to drink, I somehow or another, by the early 80s, launched on a professional career, which I later progressed in and continued on for many, many, many years. But what I didn't do was what I really should have done, which was to continue to write and get that all important first book published, which I didn't do. I was a creative person. I was a person that had poetry inside me. and I failed to get it out year after year after year after year until I was so involved in professional life of a different sort and traveling and working very hard and going around places where it was gone, basically. It was pretty much extinguished. And as I'm not going to go into, maybe going on a little too long in my segment, but I want to finish this. Uh, I've talked about my own story here before. I got to a point, even though I was working and progressing in that way, personally, I was just continuing to sort of de-evolve in this alcoholism thing where, my brain was becoming toxic and more toxic. And by the age 38, I was so desperately ill that I had to do something. And I ended up on that fateful day finally stopping, which was January 1987. But life,
How old were you then?
38,
38.
38 when I quit. Okay. But by the time that continuum from the time that my alcoholism really kicked in until the time that I actually quit, the artistic ambitions had pretty much been thrown away, flushed out, gone. One of those things that you look back on in regret, woulda, coulda, shoulda sort of thing. Because I was involved in this DC scene, and I met the person who became my second wife, and we ended up having two. First child in 94, second child in 96, now 30 and 28-year-old wonderful young women who I was fortunate enough to be the father of, and a lot of responsibilities and a lot of stuff in sobriety, which kept me away from what I thought I really should do. Now, parenthetically, I mentioned this guy before, a guy by the name of Gaston Neal, very well-known poet and raconteur of the Black arts movement and pretty famous in Washington, but also very well-known by people in the Black arts movement all around the country. Pretty well-known guy. I met him in the very early 90s, like 1990, I guess, maybe late 89. Met him in the atheist agnostic meeting that was started in 88 here in DC. And Gaston became a very, very close friend of mine, right? And I was with him all the way until the end of his life as a close friend till 1999. And Gaston was a very perceptive person. And he knew people's stories, and he knew about people, and he was super intuitive. As a heroin addict and alcoholic, he was extremely successful, right? Until he wasn't anymore. He became like a famous rogue around DC. He was an amazing guy. He can be Googled. He's a really interesting guy to Google. There's a certain amount of stuff about him out there. But I'll never forget when he got sick from lymphoma, it became my pleasure to pick him up and take him to a meeting every Sunday morning and bring him home and spend time with him at lunch. And, we were very close. And one day I'm out with him, and apropos of nothing, this had to be maybe early 99, the year that he died, or late 88, 98. He looks at me and he says, "John, you're a poet. I know you're a poet, and you will write again," he said. Without any prompting, any information, know nothing, right? And I said, well, that's interesting, Gaston, considering where I am today, walking down M Street in my Brooks Brothers suit on the way to a meeting somewhere and not quite fit the mold, right?
Yeah.
And he says, I know it. He says, I know it. And then he was gone, which was very sad for me. But that words he put in my head in sobriety as an atheist, he was a militant, adamant atheist. I mean, he made me look like Mother Teresa or something. Gaston was something. I think his communism and his atheism got him really. He was a very militant guy. I loved him though. He's a much more militant person than I ever was. But somehow that stuck in the back of my mind through the years of work and after 9/11, when my career got catapulted in a whole other direction, and then through the time when I started my business in Russia and met my current wife, Guli, who you know. And
So is that when you started writing again, this majorly?
it was a back door. It's true. It was a
Yeah,
back door. It was really interesting
because all that
because
Russian stories are pretty
we're
interesting.
we're sitting in the apartment in Moscow one day, and I was expressing my admiration for who I consider to be the best 20th century poet, a guy by the name of Yesenin, best Russian poet of the 20th century, very sort of well known over here as having been involved with Isadora Duncan.
Hmm.
That was his big flame, who he met when she was in Russia. And Yesenin's famous claim to fame in the U.S., he was brought here to read poetry with a translator about 1921 or 22 or something like 23, like that. And he got off the boat from Russia with Isadora, and Yesenin was a revolutionary Bolshevik. Okay, and they asked Yesenin, Mr. Yesenin, what is your opinion of America? And it was translated to him, and he said, "Here is my poem for America." And he pulled out a revolver and fired 3 shots at the air. Yesenin was something else. But his poems are great. And I was expressing to Guli how bad I thought the translations were. And she looked over across the table at me and she said, well, why don't you do one? And I said, well, how am I going to do that? She says, well, I'll help you out with the philology. We use the English-Russian dictionary all the time. And my Russian's almost non-existent except for reading metro signs and menus and shit. But I took a stab at it. And lo and behold, when I got done with one of his most famous poems, I looked at it, and I looked at the translations, and I said, the other translation, I said, oh shit, this isn't so bad, right? Actually, this is really good. And that started me on the path to write my first book.
Cool.
That was about 2000. Got me started on the idea of writing a book about Moscow, which slowly came to be over the next few years. And, through a series of things my wife and I went through personally, and I went through professionally, there was a lot of things going on and a lot of content that arose from those experiences which became my first book, a thing called the Moscow Poetry File,
Now,
which,
why did you choose to do poetry instead of just a long form
well,
historical
because
novel? I mean, all
the
your
real the
experiences,
real story that way
there's
would have
so much
probably,
going on in each of those
yeah,
poems.
I know, but the real story that way would have, considering, I don't want to go into all of it, but I could have ended up quite dead as a result of writing a narrative about everything I knew
Yeah, yeah.
about what was happening in that fucking place.
Well, and that's the beauty of poetry. I mean, it's all in there.
It's there, but it's not. It
It's
doesn't
thick.
have
You know,
names, dates,
every
places, and
word has so much stuff attached
easily.
to it. Yeah,
Right, right.
good
It
stuff.
does.
It's good
And
stuff. It's very good
well,
stuff.
thank you. And then it got me back involved with uh and that book is uh, that's a bit of an atheist tome as well. There's a
Hmm.
lot of atheist thought in that book if you look through certain parts. So atheism figured into that as well.
Well, you
But
don't give credit to the divine in any of that. I mean,
no, there's none of that. No, no, no.
yeah,
All right. It's like,
which a lot of classical poetry does. I mean, it
well,
gets into the whole
there's a lot of,
spiritual, divine stuff.
well, no, but when it's good, it's good. I'm not going to put everything down. William Blake is a hero of mine,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he literally had those little
yeah,
angels
yeah,
dancing on the head of a pin and
yeah.
speaking to him while he was doing his amazing.
He was possessed.
And Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Jesuit, very devout
Mhm.
Jesuit priest who wrote some of the most amazing things out there. So, John Donne was a cleric that wrote in the 17th century some of the greatest things. So I'm not going to completely discount those people, but from my point of view and my perspective, able to do what I've been able to do, which is some, right? I've had a lot of publications here and there. Got back very close in touch with an old poet friend of mine out on the West Coast, a guy by the name of Gary Lemons, who's written a series of books, uh, the Snake series, which is really astonishing. Gary's somebody who I greatly admire, who's
I
well
mean,
known.
but back to sobriety in those cases. How many of those writers that you are fond of were uh, uh, addicts and alcoholics,
Oh,
and how
well,
many of
as far as
them
a lot of the ones,
lived a short life?
some of the
And
great poets, I mean, my just about favorite American poet, a guy by the name of Harold Hart Crane,
hmm,
a total alcoholic who got drunk and jumped off the back of a steamer in 1936. And then Dylan Thomas, the prototype of all drinking, bar crawling poets, which I thought I was one of. Unfortunately, I wasn't writing much of anything. Drank his 20 shots and sailed out of the Chelsea hotel to the hospital to die. And many, 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 many more. All right.
but that in one respect, that's a problem for us because we both admired all of those artists in the past who were addicted and were raging alcoholics in many cases and produced incredibly great stuff.
Right.
And the main drawback is the fact that they died young usually or died
Right.
tragically.
Well,
But we had that example, a positive example of people being under the influence and being very creative. And for me, I assume it's for you as well. That was kind of a misdirection in my life I
that was
looked up to
always
that. Like that's what I was supposed to
right.
do. I was
Right.
supposed to be drunk whenever I made my art.
Right. Well, and that's true. They were incredible role models, which you could view as being positive in that way. But for every one of those, there's probably hundreds of others that died of alcoholism or addiction who you've never heard of
Yeah, yeah. Who really didn't
and
accomplish anything. Yeah.
who you'll never hear of.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So life's, you know, unfair. All right. But what I'm going to postulate here, which sort of gets us back on the topic of being sober and being atheists at the same time
And creative.
and creative all together at the same time,
Right.
is the fact that even though my creativity was greatly diminished by my alcoholism, and I pissed away the golden years of any artist, which I believe is your 20s, basically.
Mm.
If you look historically speaking, 20s, 30s, okay?
Yeah.
Very few people like William Butler Yeats who write their greatest poem when they're almost 80,
Mm.
right? Which he did, all right? Very few of those. But the fact remains is, if I hadn't have gotten and stayed sober, I never would have written anything.
Yeah. There you go.
It
Bottom
was
line.
a long, curving, windy road to get back to where I should have been to begin with. And the misdirection that we take as alcoholics and addicts is thinking we're on a road of progress when we're really on the road to end our existence.
Right.
You went through a little bit of that.
Yes, but in hindsight, man, I'm a lucky bastard. I mean, I followed some of those examples of artists who I thought were great and inspiring, as well as raging alcoholics and addicts and all of that. And I must say that I was relatively lucky that I got as much done as I did. My addictions really, I think, they really just prevented me from producing as much as I could have. But I was lucky to have gotten a lot done. I mean, I have to admit, now there's a lot of circumstances along the way there that I'm probably being too nice about. But in hindsight, man, I'm lucky that I got as much done as I did. And the time period that I was doing it was also a time period where other people were doing the same thing. They were just as fucked up as I was, and it was encouraged. It wasn't really discouraged. My prime time back in New York City in the late 70s and 80s, I was just part of the zeitgeist. I was doing what everybody else was doing, and it didn't seem unusual back then. I stayed out of relative trouble. There were a lot of relationship tragedies and all that stuff along the way, but I still got a lot done. I was showing my art and making it, and I think now that I'm sober and I'm making art, I can see that my vision is much clearer. I'm a lot more honest about the art that I make today. I'm not as compulsive. I'm not as impulsive, and I'm much more engaged. I'm much more engaged.
Yeah, but
It's not
look at
like a
all the
blur that
things.
goes
Yeah,
by. So my worst outcome of my addictions versus my creativity was the diminishing quantity. I was able to do
yeah,
less and less and less as I got further and further into my addictions. It became my addictions. I mean, I remember the last couple of years when I was using uh, being in my studio and just, like smoking pot all day long, thinking about what I was going to do next, and then spending maybe half an hour doing what I thought I was supposed to be doing, but hours and hours of contemplation and smoking and drinking and just, bullshit, and essentially killing myself. So I'm so much more pleased with realizing that sober I can just produce so much more, and
And in
it's
different
so much
mediums
real.
as well. Look at, I'm always amazed by when you're telling me you're doing this, you're doing that, you're acting, you're, stage managing, you're producing, you're doing all kinds of creative stuff.
Yeah, it's a little bit crazy too. I mean, yeah, and in fact, there's part of me that misses that, being able to numb myself once in a while and turn all that off, because I've got so many things going on in my head, so many projects that I want to do, and I'm in such a hurry because I'm getting older and I want to get things done before I die, and I I miss being able to grab a bottle of whiskey and just crack it open
Uh,
and guzzle half of it and just sit down and forget about everything, and
well,
because
I don't
that's something I
miss.
have a hard time doing, because it's constantly going all the time. So that's the part of addiction that I really miss. And that's the part
Uh,
of addiction that I was addicted to. I was addicted to that idea of numbing it, just stopping it, turning it all off temporarily, you know, uh, um,
well,
and
you know,
and I have to admit that, and that's why I try to stay sober, because I know that if I got back into that, that's all I would do, because that's how I ended up. It ended up being that's all I was doing. It was just drinking and
well,
drugging.
I had a first book in me somewhere by around 1975. I didn't publish my first book, totally different kind of book, till 2017. Okay. That's what I look back on. All right. Now, I did a lot of good stuff after I got sober. In between, I did a lot of professional things. You know, I started businesses. I got patents on various processes and things that I was doing that had creative elements to it. Started projects with people. Was kind of innovative in the way in which I approached certain problems in what I was doing. But it wasn't what I really should have done,
Mm.
because I took that substance and let it become more important than the work.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
There you
And
go.
then as a result of that, got sort of, sideways into other things, even after sobriety, that delayed that process even further.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I don't look back with any fondness. I do recall some nights when the Admiral Benbow bar literally levitated and took off and went to other realms
Mhm.
of existence that normal individuals never get to go to. All right. We just blasted the fuck off. Right. Uh,
Yeah.
those were pretty unique experiences. But the only residue that was left was the residue that resulted uh, in some pretty negative things for me.
Mm.
And in the case of many of my friends from those days, resulted in them being dead. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
That's that's the hard truth of
that's
it
the
too.
hard
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
hard part.
A lot of those
That's the
people didn't.
bad that's the bad news. But
Yeah,
the good news is that we got sober and got to do what we really were supposed to do
exactly.
in the end,
Yeah, yeah.
which goes back to the whole thing about art. Some people get to be Mark Rothko and dead. Okay. some people that get to be Jackson Pollock and dead, right? Some people get to be Dylan Thomas and dead. Right? They're incredibly famous, but they didn't get to be old people, and they're fucking dead, right? So, at the very least, I'm not comparing myself to someone like uh, the greatest 20th century poets or anything like that, but at least, and art is really for art's sake, as you well know. I mean, the satisfaction you derive is the satisfaction of the artist, not the consumer or observer of that art. It's the satisfaction the artist derives from the creation of the art. Uh, and no matter where it went, at least in the end, because of sobriety and adherence to logical principle, I was able to continue somehow at the end of the day. Not at the level I would really want to be, and not, I've got 2 completed books that haven't been published that I tell myself I'm going to keep hammering away to try to get them out there before I'm gone. But at least those books are done, one of which I'm quite proud of. But
Well,
that
now
doesn't.
before this goes too much further, too much longer, because we're going late here.
Well, we're not
How
quite at
about
the
the
time.
atheism aspect of this? Now, what influence did atheism have on your creativity and on the things you wrote? I mean,
Oh,
you
well,
mentioned before that there was
that's
nothing divine mentioned in it, like a
pretty.
lot of
That's pretty.
classical poetry does.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah, but
What it is.
as far for me, just quickly, the idea that there's no dogma, no rules, that everything is there's nothing concrete, there's nothing rigidly defined, influenced my art. Not having a belief in concrete dogma and rules, and um, being able to explore the mystery, I think is much more obvious to an atheist. Mystery seems to be defined by people of faith. They define the mystery, and so they create a concrete version of mystery. Whereas as atheists, I think it's just so much more open ended and
Right.
undefinable, and the
That,
beauty of the mystery, all of those things.
yeah, that's going to be part of our long delayed mystery podcast, which is coming up sometime.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, in my case, since you asked the good and pointed question, uh, what my work is about is what is observable,
there you go. Yep. Yeah.
what is real.
Yeah.
I just had a poem published, uh, and it's a sort of a reprise from something I did some years back when I just got back from Russia. But it was something I came up with within the last year or two. And it's me standing at the gate of Lubyanka in Moscow, which was the old headquarters of the KGB. They're across the street now. But this old insurance company building in Moscow was converted to the KGB headquarters. And that's where you were taken if you got on the wrong side of Stalin. They took you to the basement of this place and shot you in the back of the head. They they picked you up, tried and convicted you, and shot you all in the same night. Boom, you were gone. And I could literally feel when you stand by the gate where the cars brought those people in. It's the dark, chilling reality of that place is still there.
Well,
And that's what I communicated
mm,
in that fairly long piece that was published 6, 8 months ago about that experience in reality of seeing, feeling, and knowing those people there. And then seeing some things in my own country right now that are somewhat analogous
mm,
in their own weird way
yeah.
to that sort of thing. So that looking at the real world in a real way and using your creativity to reproduce the feelings of that world, even of a time and place
Mm,
you were never at, through your experience of where you are now and feeling that. I swear, if you were standing at that gate with me, you would feel what I'm talking about.
yeah. Yeah.
I get the fucking, I'd get the, every once in a while, I'd go there
Mm,
and get the fucking shivers standing by that gate, knowing what happened in that place, right? All those many, many years ago. So, what the atheist does, in my opinion, is take the real world and transfer ideas and states about that real world that you might not have literally participated in, but you reproduce and restate those things based on history, reality, feeling of time and place that's real. It's
mm,
not some fucking fantasy
right. Right.
like these people we see on TV these days with their little fucking crosses hanging around their neck, talking about how righteous they are
Mm,
because something that doesn't exist came and changed something. Things that don't exist don't change things. Only things in the real world change things.
mm,
It's my job to report real things in the real world and how the real world changes things,
mm,
not how some fucking fantasy world changes things. That's what the best artists do.
mm,
It's about the real world. Even somebody like David Lynch, where it's all about like the so-called spirit world and all this other stuff. This is all his reimagining of the dreams that we have when we go to sleep at night.
mm, mm,
They're the state of how the brain reacts to the world in a dream state, which is real.
mm.
It's not cosmological.
Yeah.
It has to
Yeah.
do with neurons, has to do with chemistry, has to do with experience.
And I'll throw
Right?
in a little bit about what I think um, atheism helps me with, and
Sure.
that is curiosity.
Oh, yeah.
I think Leonardo da Vinci had a written, a well documented formula for creativity. It was like a 9 or 10 step process that he went through and explained how every human could be creative by simply following this formula. Part of that, the initial part of that whole formula was to nurture your curiosity, because it's curiosity that draws us to everything else. It opens the door to our imagination. It opens the door to explanations of those phenomena. It opens the door to invention. It opens the door to creative problem solving. All of those things are first stimulated by curiosity. And if you are a person of faith, there's much less curiosity. It's all figured out. It's all explained. There's nothing to question. It's all, the dogma is there. This is the way the world works. This is the way God makes it happen, and therefore there's much less curiosity. Because there's no doubt.
Yeah, and
There's
no,
no
if you see
questioning of anything. You know.
if you see something that you and I would look at and will say that's sort of illogical. Why did that happen? Right?
Yeah.
One of these lunatics are going to look at the same thing and say, "Oh, well, that's all part of God's plan."
Yeah. Yeah.
End of story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're going to try to maybe dissect it a little bit and try to see how that, why did they do that?
Mhm.
What's going on with this?
Mhm.
Why does this piece not fit with this piece?
Yeah. Yeah.
How did that happen?
That was one of other Da Vinci's other formulas, was that I have trial and error and demonstration and observation, all of those things
All of those things.
the scientific method does.
Yeah, I
that
mean,
religion doesn't do, and
right,
scientific method does.
right. Speaking of great dead people, if Carl Sagan was here, I'm sure he could explain
Yeah.
it a lot better
Yeah.
than we possibly could. But, it's all about the wonder of the universe is in how it works.
Mhm.
And the wonderful thing about looking at the ineffable is the attempt at figuring out how it works. A gas cloud becomes a star, becomes a supernova, etc. And little by little, science is figuring out how to measure all this stuff. Things that were just dots in the sky to our ancestors are clusters of hundreds of millions of galaxies.
Yeah, no, it's pretty amazing.
Okay.
It's
And
pretty
we didn't
amazing.
know that till we could get out there and look at it
Mhm.
with something like the Webb or the Hubble or one of those, that sort of thing, or measure it somehow
Mhm.
through new innovations in particle physics. Stuff happens for a reason. And real artists are dealing with the reasons that stuff happens or the new ways that you see how stuff happens. Like the late, great Mr. Lynch, right?
There you go. Yep.
New ways of seeing, right?
Observation and interpretation and invention, all of those things.
All of those things. So,
And it's awfully easier to do that stuff sober
yeah.
and
So,
without
here,
the hindrance of a faith-based explanation for
right,
everything.
right. And thanks to your poignant questions, we have figured out in the end that atheism does in fact figure into, creativity and recovery, and uh, that this was not a cockamamie concocted topic after all. Okay, and then maybe has some reason and purpose to it,
Yeah, yeah.
given where we personally are coming from through long journeys in recovery. It's remarkable. I mean, my story, it still blows my mind that 1998, 1999, Gaston Neal is looking at me again and saying, "You're a poet, man. I just know you're going to write again." Till sitting in an apartment in Moscow, translating Yesenin in 2007 or whatever it was, 6, 7, whatever it was. Okay. With my Russian dictionary and my brilliant wife giving me some philology and then comparing and seeing and imagining and understanding Yesenin's great words. Allowing, saying, "Oh shit, I could do this," right?
There you go.
Well, you went about trial and error, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a good thing you were off the bar stool by then.
Well, I've been off the bar stool quite some time, but
That's a good
that's the
thing.
other thing. We were talking before we started recording today. We were talking about recovering from various things as older people and how it takes a while. Some of us have very extended recoveries in recovery.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I didn't have any miracle cure. Although, if you go to those ridiculous meetings that we don't talk about here, they tell you that if you do a few simple things, you will have a miraculous recovery and figure everything out, right? They say
And what
some
is it?
shit like that, right?
A personality change or something?
Yeah, they're going to have a personality change, and then you're going to have uh, a meaningful and good orderly direction in your life coming from something that doesn't fucking exist. We didn't have it that easy, man.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, it's not that easy, right? We have to sort this shit out on ourselves.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I think we've
Well, there's
gotten there.
advantages and disadvantages to that, of course. I mean,
Of course,
yeah,
there's a if you have easy answers to life, in some ways, much of life can be pretty fucking simple, right?
yeah, yeah. More power to you. You know.
You follow the formula, you don't ask any questions, and then you're sitting in a Senate committee room or someplace with one of those things hanging around your neck saying that Jesus got you there or
Oh,
saved you from your bad behavior. I heard
yeah,
that one
yeah.
this week. You know, the Lord Jesus took my bad behavior
All right, we're
away
wandering
from
off
me.
topic here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I get diverted. I'm sorry.
You're revealing the fact that you live in Washington D.C.
I'm DC centric from a tiny kid. Okay. I've been reading that there's a picture in my living room of me reading the Washington Post at age 9, or something. So, same paper I'm reading today, although it's a little disappointing recently. But, here we go. I mean, I think did we get to the point?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think at least wandered around it, tiptoed around a little bit. I think that's fine.
Well, I mean, let's hope that whatever we did is meaningful when it gets out there in the great,
Yeah,
wide, wonderful
yeah,
world. I suppose we'll find out one way or the other in the fullness of time.
yeah.
And we're getting to the point where we have to, and particularly in these difficult times, I think it's important for us to remember a word that's very important to you, a single word.
Well,
A single word. Do you want me to give you a prompt?
hope.
Hope. That's the word. Okay.
Yep, yep.
And to wish all of our friends around the world, we had some interesting countries pop up on the feed recently. We had somebody in Vietnam, a couple of other interesting spots. South Africa popped up again, some other spots around the world, in addition to our Canadian, UK, Australian, and European friends. Every once in a while, we get an interesting pop up on our feed in terms of who's listening. So we're going to wish people around the world today. We don't have any benedictions here, but we have a fervent wish for, I believe that we refer to it as peace and love.
Peace and love. Yes.
Peace
Yes.
and love.
Yep.
And we, some of us get one of the, I don't want to get with a fist. That's somebody going to misinterpret. No, give them the fist. Give them the fist. They're gonna peg us as something else. Give them a little, give them a little, Ringo Starr. Then
There
give
you
them a
go.
little,
Yep.
give them a little Abby Hoffman on the side. There you go. Dating myself now, but we're gonna just, sort of wind this up before we get diverted even more, and hope everybody enjoyed what we had to say today. And we'll
Yeah. Peace and
we'll
love.
see you the next time.
Peace and love.
Wonderful. We'll see.